Hello. How do you make a modern board game? What design decisions go into creating it? What are the economic factors at play? And how do you fill that box with fun? The designer behind some of the greatest board games of the last 30 years has been working with the aesthetic expertise of a modern action figure manufacturer. And together, they have come up with a brand new board game that pits players against one another in gladiatorial combat on a volcanic arena. And what's even better, every player is a dinosaur. Stephen Becka is the creator of HeroQuest and Space Crusade, two of the most important board games in my personal hobby journey, games that I absolutely adore. And Boss Fight Studio, they are one of the best modern makers of amazing action figures. And when the two of them reached out and asked me if I wanted to go behind the scenes of the creation of their brand new board game, Saurozoic Warriors Arena, I had to say yes. And that is why I get to say, I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today it's part 2 of the ongoing development diary of the brand new board game, Saurozoic Warriors Arena. Boss Fight Studio is based in Norwood, Massachusetts. For the past decade or so, this team of former Hasbro designers and artists have plied their trade as expert action figure makers, producing some of the coolest modern takes on articulated collectible toys. But there has been a passion welling up within Boss Fight, a need to explore play beyond the collectible, a little less articulation, a little more conversation, please. Toys that don't just move, they fight. As a collective of artists and gamers, Boss Fight wanted to do something they had never done before. They wanted to create a board game. And to do that, they wanted a little bit of help. So they turned to one of the best designers in the business. They brought in the person who had created HeroQuest.
My name's Stephen Becka, and I'm the designer for Saurozoic Warriors. I'm also the designer of games such as HeroQuest, Space Crusade, Battle Masters, and I've been in the business of designing and developing games for well over 35 years.
This is part 2 of the development diary of the Saurozoic Warriors Arena game, but you don't have to have watched part 1 to follow some really interesting stages in the creation of a modern board game. However, if you would like to find out more about Stephen Becka, the designer, and Boss Fight Studios, the action figure company who are behind this game, then you can check it out right here. After Stephen Becka had pitched a few different ideas for potential board games, one had stood out the most. It was going to be a combat game based in a gladiatorial arena, but it was going to be matched with an existing range of Boss Fight Studios figures. The Saurozoic Warriors were dinosaurs, and they were influenced in their creation by the likes of Street Sharks and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Together, these ideas were going to create a brand new game, Saurozoic Warriors Arena. A key stage in Stephen Becka's design process is the prototype. For everything from HeroQuest to Space Crusade to Battle Masters, there have been minutely detailed prototypes that do everything they can to allow an audience to picture how a game will function, how it will look, and how it will play.
It's fairly involved. I mean, I have to do the sort of like the 3D design, not the figures. That was all done by Boss Fight. But for example, in the early prototype, I had to build these columns and the grates that went on top of them. And the columns were intended to hide either weapons that in the original design you could clip into your figure, or later on tokens. It's definitely a process, but I think it's invaluable to put the time and effort into making that kind of quality prototype because you learn a lot from it, particularly when you're playtesting.
Becka's view is that even though it might take a lot of work and time, creating a prototype that is as close as you can get to the feel of what the final game might look like is worth doing, even if you have to use loosely appropriate or relevant art, if you have to borrow components, if you use stick diagrams and write cards on the back of pieces of paper. Doing that can help get players and the playtest group to a sort of experience of what that game might be like when it's finally completed. And selling that into the minds of the playtesters can be enormously influential in helping to develop the game through these various stages. Saurozoic Warriors was no different. Stephen Becka utilised existing art from the range of action figures, building cards and components to fit the rough look and feel. In earlier versions of the game, there would be character cards, action cards, and weapon cards as well. There were also 3 resources to manage: stamina with which to perform actions, health to keep you standing, and adoration, how much the crowd love your gladiator and their antics. The arena was different in that first iteration too. It featured a geyser on the central tile that would release jets of superheated air, and there were walls around the arena and 3D columns in certain spots within it. Of course, designing a board game isn't just about the rules, you have to design what it's going to look like as well. And this is where Boss Fight Studio took the full reins. This was where things would start to get very colourful, very dynamic, and very prehistoric. Boss Fight were keen to identify the visual style that would match well with the Saurozoic Warriors action figures and the rules that Stephen was developing. Whilst the original toy line was clearly inspired by 80s and 90s action cartoons, Street Sharks, Dino Riders, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Bucky O'Hare, a clean modern feel was what they wanted for the game. Starting with some design mood boards, the team drew together vibrant colour palettes and dramatic art design to create an impression of the desired look. This included gathering reference materials relevant to historical gladiatorial games as well.
Saurozoic Warriors comes from that magical moment in toy design time and action figures of the 90s, where it's these wild anthropomorphized dinosaur characters. If we made this show in 1993, it would fit right in.
As the game progressed through playtesting stages, changes were required. For example, the walls around the arena, which looked very cool, actually made it much harder to get in and interact with the playing pieces. It actually put a barrier, a literal barrier, between the players and the action of play. So they had to go. The 3D columns that were initially designed to add visual interest to the board were experimented with to see if they could house equipment chests on top as a secondary objective, but ultimately it became clear that they were simply an extra complication, and they were an additional component that was not offering enough value to the game whilst it was costing more to produce them, so they were removed in their entirety. There were rules refinements too. Stamina, for example, was clearly one resource too many. It slowed things down just that little bit too much. And the equipment cards, which initially were tied to the idea that the miniatures in the game would feature interchangeable weapon parts, were also scrapped because they were complicated. Again, it was an overcomplication of a cool idea that just didn't bring enough interest and fun to the game to warrant keeping it in.
At the end of the day, you have to constantly come back to the question of what is most important and what contributes the most to the experience that you're trying to create, right? So, I tend to sort of think in terms of the articles of play, and the articles of play might be a dice, or might be a card, or might be a playing figure. So it's like, what are you interacting with the most? What are you focused on the most? What is it that is driving your sense of gratification in playing this game, both in terms of the aesthetic, the tactile quality, how game mechanics execute? Rolling a dice is different from drawing a card, is different from grabbing a token out of a bag. They're all different in their psychology, and they're all different in terms of what they might cost to execute.
In pursuit of a more dramatic, themed backdrop for the game and some higher tension, the geyser in the centre of the board was overhauled as well. It would become a far more imposing volcano that covered 7 hexes instead of just 1. And as a 3D piece, it would also ensure that the texture of the board retained a multi-level playing space that those 3D columns had previously offered. Through prototyping and playtesting, the core rules and playing experience for Saurozoic Warriors Arena was whittled down to its most exciting version and its fastest paced. Complexities like the extra resources and cards had been managed out. Low-value objectives had been excised in favour of retaining the cleanest, most accessible, yet still incredibly fun gameplay. The card standees that Becka had created for the prototypes were making use of images for real Saurozoic Warriors action figures, but a brand new set of characters would be created as appropriately scaled miniatures to help bring the game to life. Similarly, the visual design of the game had begun to evolve, capturing the colour and dynamism from those mood boards, and bringing the Saurozoic Warriors action figures and their inspirations into every single component and facet of the game, adding a flourish from the gladiatorial theme to the prehistoric magic of the original Saurozoic Warriors line.
I've been absolutely thrilled with the work that Boss Fight have done on the game, and one of the things that really inspired me about the game in the first place were the Saurozoic Warrior action figures. Highly articulated. You can get a lot of character out of them as you pose them. But it's been interesting to see how at least the spirit of that idea has translated into some very, very dynamic sort of comic art, lots of forced perspectives, very sort of action sort of packed. And it's great to sort of see that thread, run through.
Miniatures were being sculpted, final art was being illustrated, and precise rules wording was being composed. Saurozoic Warriors Arena was becoming a finalized product. But there was still a lot of work to do, because it's all well and good having a complete, amazing game in your computer. But at some point, it needs to become a physical thing that you can actually put into a box and give to someone to play. Next time in the Development Diary, we will take a look at how those physical components came together into the final product, and how you get ready to launch on Kickstarter with a compelling, eye-catching campaign. You can actually go and check out the pre-launch page right now via the link in the description. Of course, no matter how effective your planning, there is always the potential that external factors could have a negative impact on what you're working on. And in this case, a pressing political issue was emerging that threatened to derail the entire project. Global trade tariffs would play a major role in the next phase of development for Saurozoic Warriors Arena. We will continue the development story of Saurozoic Warriors Arena next time. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. For some reason, when it comes to dinosaurs, I've always really liked the long-necked lads. No idea why, but I think Brachiosaurus is probably my favourite. What is your favourite dinosaur?